Thank you, choir. Gorgeous. Thank you. Well, for those of you who have been listening to my sermons for a while, you know that I like to begin, oftentimes, with a story. In fact, my first sermon with you was entitled A Story Worth Telling, and my last one with you, the end of June, will be called The Story of Your Future Happiness. I like to tell stories from real life because that is where our theology and our values intersect with moments of encounter in real time. It is in the stories that we tell ourselves and each other that formulate a version of reality. And it can be profoundly disorienting when your version of reality and mine conflict with one another. Such is the story of my encounter with a man named Joseph on a bright and cold Monday morning, November 5th, 2024. Does that date sound familiar? It was the day before the presidential election, and my husband and I had volunteered to staff the table outside the polling place in front of our in support of our presidential candidate. Next to our table, separated by about a hip's distance, was Joseph's table. Joe, a white man in his mid to late 70s, was handing out buttons and information about the other candidate for president. And my story today is about an encounter with Joe that led me to a conclusion that is embedded in this morning's sermon title, I Am That Too. But first, I must set the stage for you. Our two tables outside the polling booths, as I said, were there to provide information about the candidates. And as people came to vote, they would stop at our table, others would stop at his. But for long stretches of time, we would have nothing to do. And Joe and I would glance over at each other and nod. But it was clear that both of us were wary of speaking to one another. But during a lull in the stream of voters, Joe leaned over in my direction, and he said, hey, can I ask you a question? I said, okay. Can you tell me why you think your candidate is prepared to be president of the United States of America? And what happened next was a brief but deep dive into one man's assessment of progressive politics, his abhorrence of wokeness, and the story about the history of race and racism in America that he rejects, as well as the one that he embraces. So throughout this sermon, I'm going to return to that conversation, not because he was the definitive spokesman for opposing views, but because of what was revealed throughout what ultimately became a 2.5-hour conversation. Now, I have to tell you this. I am not proud of this, but if I'm honest, I was spoiling for a fight. I saw this as an opportunity to sharpen my intellectual jujitsu, to come back at him with such irrefutable arguments about the fallacies of his position that he would fold up his table and come join mine. What proceeded instead was a list of issues that later I realized were drawn directly from Project 2025, the playbook on how to reshape the federal government and consolidate executive power in favor of right-wing policies. So this is the document that is directing all of the executive orders, from the trivial, such as Executive Order 14264, which is maintaining acceptable water pressure in shower heads. I'm not kidding, this is an executive order, to the truly troubling Executive Order 14173, ending illegal discrimination and resisting merit-based opportunity. Now, from its title, that executive order sounds fairly innocuous. I mean, who could be against ending illegal discrimination? That's where you have to read the fine print. It continues, quote, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, critical and influential institutions of American society have adopted and actively use dangerous, demeaning, and immoral race and sex-based preferences under the guise of so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI can violate the civil rights laws of this nation. Just sit with that for a minute. DEI can violate the civil rights laws of this nation. It undermines the traditional American values of hard work, excellence, and individual achievement in favor of an unlawful, corrosive, and pernicious identity-based spoils system. It continues, hard-working Americans who deserve a shot at the American dream should not be stigmatized, demeaned, or shut out of opportunities because of their race or sex, end quote. So what I find so troubling, and I would actually say appalling about this, is that it is a blatant effort to reverse the intent of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And although it is not explicitly written in the executive order, it seeks to redefine the protections of that law, ironically, for white people. When Lyndon Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act, he and the Congress of his day knew that race-neutral policies would perpetuate the effects of discrimination if left unchecked. So what this executive order would do is to further the belief that the people most oppressed, most under attack from the left, the woke mob, the radical judges, are white people. Most of us were upset about this executive order, but beyond this single order are other policies that represent an effort to change history itself, to whitewash all of the aspects of American history that historians today consider to be an essential part of the American story. America's wealth was not built solely by hardworking Europeans who worked the land and started businesses and developed the country. It was built on the labor and the backs of 200 years of institutionalized racism and slavery. American culture did not arise from a monolithic white Christian Protestantism, but instead has been vastly enriched by the diversity of cultures living with and among one another, the very diversity we experience on the streets of New York City every day. So what we are witnessing today is an attempt to erase the stories which, for at least the last 60 years, scholars have researched and told to present a more complete and therefore more truthful history of this country with all of its greatness and all of its flaws. So maybe, I wondered, might Joe, my pre-election day table-tending partner, might he like to talk about this? Well, our conversation led us into a recitation of his issues. Abortion, he said, is a big one for him. Illegal aliens is another. No surprises there. And then we got down to it, these two white people talking about race. Trump doesn't capitulate to wokeness, Joe said. He fights back. I said. Well, let me ask you, do you believe that racism exists? And he thought for a minute and he said, yes, but not institutionally, not systemically like liberals keep promoting. I don't buy it. I mean, look at the Orientals, he said. They came here, they worked hard, they're not complaining about oppression. Now the conversation was taking a hard turn and becoming more intense. Well, I said, they too have faced racism and legalized oppression. And their story is different than those whose ancestors were forcibly enslaved for 200 years and subjected to some of the worst legalized oppression in the United States. And I was trying to continue, then Joe interrupted me, and he said, do you know what the problem is with people like you? The problem is that you teach black people what they can and can't do. You tell them that they are incapable of rising to greatness, that they are inferior. The policies that I want to see put in place are colorblind. We are all equal. We don't need affirmative action or all the laws protecting other races because in God's eyes, we are all the same. So when Joe said people like you, I must admit I saw red. Oh, well, maybe it was actually bright blue. I was feeling the anger rising in my chest. I took a deep breath. And maybe you might feel the need to take a deep breath right now, too, especially if you are a person of color. Because stories like this about two white people arguing about which color are more oppressed can be infuriating for anyone in the bullseye being targeted by the current policies. So I want you to know I see you. So I was mad. because there Joe was, lumping me into the story that he had about me in his head, and that just got my back up. And you know how you get when you get fired up and you try to get a hold of yourself before you fly off the handle, and you can have a lot of different thoughts through your mind. Well, that's what was going on with me. And one voice in my head was ranting. I'm going to tell you what it was ranting. It said, what is driving this guy to believe an American story in which everyone is supposed to have an equal chance to become what? Like Steve Rogers, Captain America from Marvel Comics and the Avenger films? An ideal that is white, blonde, able-bodied, attractive, kind, considerate, and a super soldier fighting for truth, justice, and liberty? Well, I have to say, my heart had become pretty hardened by that point. And the arguments I had started to frame were like daggers. Anger, hot, desire to not only persuade, but to conquer was front and center. And we reached a stalemate. Joe was no longer the mid-70s gentleman with this genial smile and easy demeanor. He was the enemy. The antithesis of everything I held dear. I could not see a way out, and I could not see myself in him at all. But there was another voice in my head as I took that deep breath, a voice that said, you know, the last thing that Joe said, in God's eyes, we're all the same. Kind of believes that too. And when I heard that voice, I had a flash of a different Joe, not a Joe wearing the Captain America uniform, but instead a guy trying to apply the values that he had learned in his church in the best way he could to solve the political problems of our time. And then another thought flashed through my head. It's an image of a Minnesota vanity license plate that my colleague and friend, the Rob Eller Isaacs, had ordered for his car year after year. It had 6 letters and a number, and it was IAMTHAT 2. I am that too. That's a Sanskrit phrase. And it's a central concept in Hinduism. And it's a translation of Tat Tavam Asi. And in the holy book of the Upanishads, it refers to the relationship between one's own identity and the entirety of the universe, and that the one and the many are not separate. All that I admire and strive to become, I am that too. And all that I despise and reject, I am that too. It is both exhilarating and humbling to acknowledge that we contain the multiverse, because it means we also have to acknowledge the parts of ourselves we wished we didn't have. Several decades ago, when I was in seminary, one of my mentors got into the pulpit one Sunday morning to preach a sermon that changed my life. This was a colleague who was a straight, white, Southern male minister who heeded the call to Selma, Alabama, who had worked his entire life to combat racism and oppression, to challenge white supremacy culture. And he stood up in the pulpit that day and said something that shocked me. He said, I want to confess something to you. I am a racist. You could hear the congregation gasp. And then he continued, and I am sexist. Again, more gasping. And I am homophobic. But it's what he said next that also stuck with me. He said, I'm not a racist because I want to be. But what I've learned is that racism and homophobia and sexism, and he would have likely added other isms, is the culture that raised me, even if my parents resisted it. It's in the air. It's in the water. It's my task, it's our task to be able to identify it when it asserts itself. That's our secret weapon. That's our special power. To name it when you see it, and the first place to look is in yourself. In other words, I am that too. His sermon reminded me that we can hold multiple truths at a time. We can actively fight racism and acknowledge we are embedded in it. We can criticize this country and we can love it and defend it fiercely. We can acknowledge our American heroes and heroines while admitting their human flaws and failings. Meanwhile, I realized while I was doing deep breathing, Joe was moving along to his next talking point, immigrants, the scourge of illegal aliens, and how his candidate was going to get them all out of the country. And I stood there listening to his talk, and again I asked myself, how am I that too? I'll bet you want to know what brilliantly, spiritually deep response I came up with next. Well, I didn't have to, because that's when Barbara stepped in. And Barbara was an external election integrity observer who was sitting near my table. And before I could open my mouth, she said, "You know, I've been listening to the two of you, and I was wondering if I could share a story with you both about my experience with immigrants." And at that point, Joe and I were both glad to have someone else to talk to, so we both were like, yeah, sure. Well, Barbara began telling a personal story of a family she met while working as a nurse at the hospital. This family had made their way to America because they had a son who was born with his intestines outside of his body. And there was no facility in their country that could help this infant. Well, Barbara described in vivid detail about what this family went through and how members of the Charlottesville community had rallied in support of this family. And she had pictures of Gabrielle and Maria and their baby, coincidentally also named Joseph, who is now 5 years old. And as she told this story, I once again had more than one thought. Part of me was moved by Barbara's story. And then there was this other voice in my head that was saying, oh, a bleeding heart story is not going to make any difference to this guy. And when Barbara was finished, she asked Joe, I wonder if you know any immigrants personally, anything of their stories, their families. And Joe surprised me. He continued to stare at the picture of the 5-year-old, and then he spoke softly and he said, yes, I do. And then I heard some of Joe's story. It's too complex and time-consuming to tell here. But he acknowledged he has a close relationship with one of his neighbors. And as he finished telling his story, I felt my own heart began to soften. And I said to him, look, a few minutes ago, I really got on my liberal soapbox. I cut you off a couple of times. I'm sorry. And immediately he responded in kind. He said, yeah, I got pretty hot myself. Sorry about that. Now, I'd like to say, or I have to tell you what didn't happen, was that Joe folded up his booth and came over to mine. Nor do I suspect that he changed his vote or changed his mind, but what did change was the air between us. And by that I mean telling a different story, a humble, truthful, and honest story humanized all of us. I could see the same anger and self-righteousness in myself as I saw rising in Joe. The heart is not a songbird, writes the poet, singing only one note at a time, more like the Tuvan throat singer. able to sing both a drone and simultaneously 2 or 3 harmonies high above a sound. The Tuvin say that gives the impression of wind swirling among the rocks. This insistent breeze leads us wordlessly deeper into ourselves, blessing us with paradox, the poet reminds us, and also reminds us of the awareness that I am that too. I am Joe, I am Kathleen, I am Barbara, I am foe, I am friend, I am racist, I am anti-racist. I know this is not a political strategy that will change a policy. For that, I have to count on the lawyers and nonprofits and political leaders. Our political strategies, however, must be accompanied by spiritual practice to keep us whole, to keep us centered, so that we do not become that which we hate. And as the poet says, so that we might walk more openly into this world, so rife with devastation, so ripe with joy. May it be so.